Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to talk about Amazon Aurora. Now Aurora is a database engine that's available in RDS and it's actually a bespoke database engine that's been created by Amazon and it was announced at reInvent in 2014. Now it's not something that you can go and download and install on a server in your home. Aurora will only run on AWS infrastructure. It's not something like MySQL, for example, which you can install locally on your device. That being said, however, it is MySQL compatible. So long as you've got a MySQL style database, you can run that same database on Aurora, and it's quite easy to do an import over to Aurora. So what is Aurora? Well, it's a MySQL compatible relational database engine that combines the speed and availability of high-end commercial databases with the simplicity and cost effectiveness of open source databases. Amazon Aurora provides up to 5 times better performance than MySQL at a price point that's 1/10 of that of a commercial database, while delivering similar performance and availability. So when this was first announced, they were saying it's a big challenge to Oracle, and it really is. You do get all the advantages of Aurora, and we'll cover those off in the next slides. And it's very similar to what advantages you get with Oracle in terms of high availability and performance. The great thing about Aurora, though, is that it's a fraction of the cost of Oracle. So this is a really sort of advanced database technology that has been launched by Amazon, and so far the feedback in the last year has been pretty good. Now, all this being said, Aurora probably won't be on your exam just yet. It hasn't made its way onto the exam, and I get feedback from students quite a bit about what's on the exam, and there have been no Aurora questions just yet. However, because it's such an important part of RDS, and you're always prompted to use Aurora when you're logging into RDS, it's very good to have at least some understanding what Aurora is and what it does before sitting the exam, because you never know, they can update the exams at any given time. Okay, so let's talk about Aurora's scaling capabilities. First of all, you start with a 10 gig database effectively, and it scales in 10 gig increments, and storage auto scales, so you don't have to go worry about provisioning more storage or anything like that. As soon as you go over 10 gigs, you'll automatically get another 10 gigs worth of storage. The compute resources can also scale up to 32 vCPUs and 244 gigs of memory. They say it's push button scaling. It's not like DynamoDB in the sense that you won't have any downtime. When you do scale Aurora, you would normally do this during a maintenance window. That being said, though, to scale up an Aurora instance actually only takes a couple of minutes, so it's quite quick in terms of how fast it can scale. The next great thing about Aurora is it maintains 2 copies of your database in each availability zone with a minimum of 3 availability zones. So this means effectively you've got 6 copies of your data. And Aurora is designed to transparently handle the loss of up to 2 copies of data without affecting database write availability, and up to 3 copies of your data without affecting any read availability. So it's really, really highly redundant. The other thing you should know about Aurora is that the storage is self-healing. So data blocks and disks are continuously scanned for errors, and they're repaired automatically if an error has been detected. So the last thing you should know about Aurora is the replica features, and we'll actually go in and have a lab and I'll show you how to provision all this, but you've got 2 different types of replicas available. So we've got Aurora replicas, and these are basically a separate Aurora database from your original Aurora database, and you can have up to 15 Aurora replicas, and then you can also have MySQL read replicas just like with MySQL that you would normally have in RDS, so you can have up to 5 MySQL read replicas. Now the key difference between an Aurora replica and a MySQL read replica is the failover. So if you do lose your primary Aurora database for whatever reason, failover will automatically occur to your Aurora replica. It will not automatically occur over to your MySQL read replica, however. Okay, so I'm just going to show you guys a quick lab, and we're going to go in and provision an Aurora instance and then an Aurora replica instance. And it's just important to note that this is not covered in free tier at all. So if you do want to go ahead and do this at home, you can, but you are going to be charged, and you should probably budget at least $5 or $10 because these are quite big instances. So don't leave these instances running by accident. Okay, so I've logged into the AWS console and you've noticed that I'm in the Irish region. It's important to note that Aurora is only available in certain regions. So if you go over to RDS and you can't see Aurora as being an option, then just go over to Ireland or US East 1. Those are definitely two regions where Aurora is supported. Now, Amazon do push Aurora quite heavily. You'll notice as soon as you log into RDS, it always, the very top of the screen says Amazon RDS for Aurora, and it tells you to launch an Aurora instance. If you go into launch a DB and you try and use MySQL, it will actually prompt you again to launch Amazon Aurora and say that it's recommended. So we're going to go ahead and launch an Aurora instance. And so straight away, it's pretty much like the typical RDS screens, but first thing you'll notice is DB instance class. You're not going to get any T2 micros here. We start with an R3 large, and you can go all the way up to an R3 8 extra large. So I'm just going to do the minimum one, so 2 vCPUs, 15 gigs of RAM, so it's quite a heavy machine. And then you can you can specify whether or not you want it in a multi-AZ deployment. And this is basically whether or not you're going to create an Aurora replica in a different zone. So I'm going to go ahead and just say no for now, because we're going to create our own Aurora replica after this instance has been created. And now I'm going to type in here a cloud guru Aurora. And then I'm just going to cut and paste the DB identifier as the username and as the password. And with failover, you get these different tiers. And so this is different priorities. And if you remember, you can have up to 15 Aurora replicas. And then basically the Aurora replica that, basically takes over, becomes the master copy, is the one that has the highest tier. So we're going to say this is a tier 0, and then when we go and create our next Aurora replica, we're going to say tier 1. And then if we have an Aurora replica of tier 2, tier 1 is always going to become the master before tier 2, etc. And it says the priority logic over here. So tier 1 is the highest, tier 0 is the highest, followed by tier 1 all the way down to tier 15. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And we can do our advanced settings. So I'm just going to create this. I'm going to leave it in my RDS security group. I'm going to leave it in my default VPC. I'm going to make it publicly accessible. Availability zone, I'm not going to set a preference. And in here, we've got to enter our cluster identifier. So I'm just going to call it a cloud guru cluster. And if you just read over here, it explains what it is. So it says you may optionally specify an identifier for the DB cluster that will be created along with your instance. If you do not provide one, a default identifier based on the instance identifier will be used. The cluster identifier is used in determining the cluster's endpoint. So basically, this is going to make up the DNS address of your Aurora instance. And for the database name, I'm just going to call it a Cloud Guru Aurora. And I'm going to leave everything else as default. We can enable encryption, so it will encrypt everything at rest, and that's using the AWS Key Management Service. But I'm going to just keep it simple for now and say no. And here we can adjust our backup retention period. So we've got a minimum of 1 day all the way up to 35. The default is 1, so very similar to what RDS is. Monitoring, we can have enhanced monitoring into CloudWatch. I'm going to leave that as no for now. And then we've got our maintenance, and you can set your maintenance windows in here. So I'm going to leave everything else as default and go ahead and launch the instance. And we can see my DB instance is now being created. Now, if we had turned on multi-AZ, it was going to launch 2 instances. It's going to launch our Aurora instance followed by basically our replica. But because we turn that off, we're only going to have 1 Aurora instance. Now, Aurora databases can take some time to provision. They can take up to 5-10 minutes, so you're going to have to be patient. So right now, I'm just going to pause the video, and I'm going to wait for this to come online. Okay, so my Aurora instance is now available, and you can see it here, status is available. And the first thing you'll notice is it says multi-AZ no, and then it also says the replication role, and this is a writer, so this is designed for write. And you can see here that it is in the EU West 1C zone. Now, if you don't get that zone, you just have to go up into settings and then scroll down and click on zone, and then it will show you the zone by default. So if you remember, we have 6 copies of our data spread across 3 availability availability zones, it's still important to remember that Aurora is running off a virtual machine, and this virtual machine is a single point of failure, and this virtual machine is going to sit inside EU West 1C. So if this virtual machine did fail, although our storage is spread across 6 availability zones, if let's say we lost EU West 1C as our availability zone, we need to automatically fail over to another availability zone. So the way we do this is we need to create an Aurora replica. So we'll go in and go create Aurora replica. And what we do is we've got our Aurora replica source. We'll use the same DB instance class, by the way, but that's our source database. And I'm going to call this this database a Cloud Guru replica. So if we scroll down, we've got our network and security. So do we want our replica to be publicly accessible? I'm going to say yes. Do we want it in a different availability zone? I'm going to say no preference, and Amazon will automatically put it in a separate one to our primary. And then here is our failover. So this is where we would say our different tiers. So I'm going to make this a tier 1 failover. And then if I was to create additional Aurora replicas, so it could have tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc. And so tier 1 is always going to be the first place that it will fail over to. So that's the tier logic, the priority tier logic, which is explained here. I'm going to leave everything else as is and go ahead and create my Aurora replica. And so that is now creating, and you can see straight away the replication role is a reader. It's not going to be a writer. So this instance is where you can go and do read traffic from, but if you're going to write your traffic, you're going to need to use the writer role. And if we also just go and look at our original Aurora, and we'll talk about our cluster endpoints. So when we created our cluster, we called it a Cloud Guru -cluster, and you can see that that has made up this DNS endpoint name, and this is what you use in your connection strings for your applications in order to connect into the database. Okay, so this is going to take a little bit of time. Just one other thing I want to point out to you. You can now see that multi-AZ has gone and says 2 zones. If I was to add another Aurora read replica, let's say a replica of the primary, then of course it will then say 3 zones, etc. So you can have more than 2, you can have up to as many availability zones that's within your region as possible. So for like US East 1, you can have up to 4 zones. Here I'm just going to leave it as 2 zones, and I'm going to wait for this replica to finish being created. So I'm just going to pause the video here, and I'll see you in a second. Okay, so we've got our Aurora read replica available. So it says here Aurora a Cloud Guru replica, and you can see that this replication role is a reader. And if we just click down and compare these 2 different instances, you'll notice something interesting. So this is the instance endpoint, and this is the DNS address for this particular instance endpoint. This is the cluster endpoint, so this is the DNS address for the cluster. Now, if this particular instance was to fail, the cluster DNS address is automatically going to fail over to this instance endpoint. So you don't need to go in and update your connection strings. Amazon handle all the failover. So you always use the cluster endpoint when you are putting this into your connection strings, as opposed to the instance endpoint, unless you want to access this particular instance. So that's just one important difference to notice. Again, it's probably not going to come up in the exam. It's just interesting, from a production perspective. So a couple of more things. We can go up here and we can go to our instance actions, and we can actually do a failover. We can also take a snapshot or restore to a point in time. We can create another replica if we want to, but I'm just going to leave everything as it is now, and I'm just going to go in and start deleting these instances. So I'm going to delete my read replica first, and just go up here because this does cost us money. Go ahead and just hit delete. It's going to ask us if we want to create a final snapshot, I think. Oh no, not on the read replica, but it will definitely ask us on the primary one. And you can see here, if I just hit delete, nothing's happening. It probably is because my read replica needs to delete first before I can delete the cluster. So I'm just going to pause the video and wait for this read replica to delete. Okay, so that has now deleted, and I'm going to go in and delete my cluster. So I'm going to click here, go to Instance Actions, and go Delete. And now straight away it's going to say, do you want to delete this? Do you want to create a final snapshot? I'm going to say no, and say I acknowledge that upon instance deletion, everything is getting deleted. This includes automatic backups, system backups, etc. Just go ahead and hit yes. and then that's it. So that's it for this lecture, guys. Like I said, Aurora actually isn't in the exam yet, but it's really good just to get a little bit familiar with it, because I'm sure when they update the questions this year, they're going to add a few Aurora questions. They are pushing it quite heavily along with EFS. So that's it, guys. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture, which is the summary lecture. Thanks a lot.